To Miss Letitia Willis, at Gloucester. My dear Letty, there is something on my spirits, which I should not venture to communicate by the post, but having the opportunity of Mrs. Brentwood's return, I seize it eagerly, to disburthen my poor heart, which is oppressed with fear and vexation. O Letty! What a miserable situation it is, to be without a friend to whom one can apply for counsel and consolation in distress. I hinted in my last, that one Mr. Barton had been very particular in his civilities. I can no longer mistake his meaning. He has formally professed himself my admirer, and, after 1,000 assiduities, perceiving I made but a cold return to his addresses, he had recourse to the mediation of Lady Griskin, who has acted the part of a very warm advocate in his behalf. But, my dear Willis, her ladyship overacts her part. She not only expatiates on the ample fortune, the great connections, and the unblemished character of Mr. Barton, but she takes the trouble to catechize me, and, 2 days ago, peremptorily told me that a girl of my age could not possibly resist so many considerations, if her heart was not pre-engaged. This insinuation threw me into such a flutter, that she could not but observe my disorder, and, presuming upon the discovery, insisted upon my making her the confidante of my passion. But, although I had not such command of myself as to conceal the emotion of my heart, I am not such a child as to disclose its secret to a person who would certainly use them to its prejudice. I told her, it was no wonder if I was out of countenance at her introducing a subject of conversation so unsuitable to my years and inexperience, that I believed Mr. Barton was a very worthy gentleman, and I was much obliged to him for his good opinion, but the affections were involuntary, and mine, in particular, had as yet made no concessions in his favour. She shook her head with an air of distrust that made me tremble, and observed, that if my affections were free, they would submit to the decision of prudence, especially when enforced by the authority of those who had a right to direct my conduct. This remark implied a design to interest my uncle or my aunt, perhaps my brother, in behalf of Mr. Barton's passion, and I am sadly afraid that my aunt is already gained over. Yesterday in the forenoon, he had been walking with us in the park, and stopping in our return at a toy shop, he presented her with a very fine snuff-box, and me with a gold 8 which I resolutely refused, till she commanded me to accept it on pain of her displeasure. Nevertheless, being still unsatisfied with respect to the propriety of receiving this toy, I signified my doubts to my brother, who said he would consult my uncle on the subject, and seemed to think Mr. Barton had been rather premature in his presence. What will be the result of this consultation, heaven knows, but I am afraid it will produce an explanation with Mr. Barton, who will, no doubt, avow his passion, and solicit their consent to a connection which my soul abhors, for, my dearest Letty, it is not in my power to love Mr. Barton, even if my heart was untouched by any other tenderness. Not that there is anything disagreeable about his person, but there is a total want of that nameless charm which captivates and controls the enchanted spirit. At least, he appears to me to have this defect, but if he had all the engaging qualifications which a man can possess, they would be excited in vain against that constancy, which, I flatter myself, is the characteristic of my nature. No, my dear Willis, I may be involved in fresh troubles, and I believe I shall, from the importunities of this gentleman and the violence of my relations, but my heart is incapable of change. You know I put no faith in dreams, and yet I have been much disturbed by one that visited me last night. I thought I was in a church, where a certain person, whom you know, was on the point of being married to my aunt, that the clergyman was Mr. Barton, and that poor forlorn I stood weeping in a corner, half naked, and without shoes or stockings. No, I know there is nothing so childish as to be moved by those vain illusions, but, nevertheless, in spite of all my reason, this hath made a strong impression upon my mind, which begins to be very gloomy. Indeed, I have another more substantial cause of affliction. I have some religious scruples, my dear friend, which lie heavy on my conscience. I was persuaded to go to the tabernacle, where I heard a discourse that affected me deeply. I have prayed fervently to be enlightened, but as yet I am not sensible of these inward motions, those operations of grace, which are the signs of a regenerated spirit, and therefore I begin to be in terrible apprehensions about the state of my poor soul. Some of our family have had very uncommon accessions, particularly my aunt and Mrs. Jenkins, who sometimes speak as if they were really inspired, so that I am not like to want further exhortation or example, to purify my thoughts, and recall them from the vanities of this world, which, indeed, I would willingly resign, if it was in my power, but to make this sacrifice, I must be enabled by such assistance from above as hath not yet been indulged to your unfortunate friend, Lydia Melford. June 10.